Night at the Beach. The Beach at Night is a true ghost story about a group of students who spend the night on a haunted beach. It is supposed to have happened in the Konkan region of India, on an unidentified beach between Alibag and Navagaon. 4 years ago, after we finished our final exams, my friends and I decided to take a beach vacation, so we could chill out and relax. There were 4 of us all together. We packed all our luggage into my friend's car and set off on our trip. Our plan was to save money by sleeping on the beach instead of wasting money on a hotel. We wanted to visit a new beach every night. Since we didn't know much about the beaches in the area, we started asking the locals. One beach in particular caught our attention. The locals told us it was always totally deserted. We wanted a quiet place, so we decided to spend the first night there. By the time we found the beach, it was already after 7 p.m. We parked our car near the road, and as we walked down to the beach, it felt as if we had landed on a different planet. The sand was black, and the water was glittering in the moonlight. We built a small fire in the sand, and sat around, eating some snacks, and drinking cans of soda. One of my friends had a flashlight with him, so we decided to explore the beach. As we were walking along the water, we heard some strange noises coming from water. At first, we thought it must be some kind of animal. But as we listened, it seemed to be coming from the water. One of my friends said he thought he heard someone calling his name. At that moment, I glanced over my shoulder and saw something in water that almost scared the life out of me. In the dim light, I could barely make it out, but it appeared to be a woman's head, floating above the surface. As I watched, she opened her mouth, and I let out a yell. My friend quickly shone his torch at that spot. But before the light could reach her, she disappeared below the water. We all heard the sound. We waited there for a long time, but she never re-emerged. We were creeped out by this, so we returned to our car and decided to go to sleep. My friend and I slept in the car while the other 3 slept on the beach, beside the fire. Around 1 a.m., we were awoken by the sound of one of our friends shouting and yelling. When we ran down to the beach, he told that he had seen a black figure floating across the beach, and when he looked towards the water, he saw a woman's head peering at him. As soon as he started yelling, she had disappeared. This really freaked everyone out, and the 2 friends who had been sleeping on the beach decided it would be safer to spend the night in the car with us. What happened next was the most frightening thing of all. Around 3 a.m., we were woken up again by loud screams and cries for help. We realized that there was only 3 of us left in the car. One of our friends was missing. We raced down to the beach and found him thrashing around in the water. He was screaming in terror. We dived in and managed to drag him out before he drowned. He was numb and still in shock. After a while, he calmed down and was able to tell us what had happened. He said he had woken up and needed to go to the toilet, so he went down to the beach and started peeing into the water. All of a sudden, he saw a woman's head floating above the surface. Before he had a chance to react, he felt someone grab his legs tightly, and he was pulled into water. He said that whatever it was very strong. He was unable to break free of its grasp, and as he was drowning, he heard it laughing. We were all so freaked out by his story that we immediately went back to the car and drove to the nearest village. When we got there, we had breakfast in a local hotel and asked some of the people from the village if they knew anything about the beach. They told us that the beach was notorious and had a reputation for being haunted. Many people had mysteriously disappeared or drowned in the waters. After all the strange things they had experienced, people stopped visiting the beach, and that was why it was deserted. They told us that, many years ago, a local girl had been out walking on the beach when she was assaulted by an unknown attacker. He abused her and cut off her head while she was still alive. That happened over 30 years ago, and ever since that terrible murder, people who visited the beach would feel something in water pulling them in. Villagers who went fishing on the beach often reported seeing a ghostly apparition, like a woman's severed head, floating above the surface of the water. Even today, the memory of this incident still sends shivers down my and it made my friends, and I believe that ghosts really do exist. The Old House. The Old House is a real ghost story about a married couple who inherit a property that is haunted. When they ask a priest to bless the house, it unleashes the evil lurking inside. There was an old couple who lived next door to me. Sometimes I would drop by to visit them and chat over a cup of tea, or ask them if they needed something from the local shops. They treated me like a granddaughter. One day, over tea, I asked the old woman why she never had children of her own. She went pale in the face, and after a while, she told me this terrible and unbelievable story. She said that shortly after they got married, the husband inherited an old house from his grandmother. It was located on the outskirts of the city. The grandmother had spent the last years of her life in a psychiatric hospital. Nobody knew exactly what happened to her. All that was known was that her hair had turned gray overnight, and she went insane. Her house had been empty for many years. Nobody ever knew about the hidden evil that lurked within. The young couple began to renovate the house, but things started going wrong from the start. Whenever they tried to do repairs, it seemed that they were taking one step forward and 2 steps back. They put up a new wallpaper, but almost immediately it was covered in damp and mold. They put in a new floor, but within days, the floorboards were soggy and rotting. The couple's health also began to decline. The husband had always been a strong and healthy young man, but he suddenly began to suffer from headaches at night. The wife discovered she was pregnant, but it wasn't long before she lost the baby. Because of all this bad luck, their parents suggested they should invite a priest to bless the home, which was the tradition at the time. This was the moment when the nightmare began. As soon as the priest arrived, the couple heard a loud ringing in their ears. They felt as if their heads would split apart. Throughout the whole house, there permeated a disgusting smell. It was an unbearable stench that seemed to come from the pits of hell. Suddenly, a powerful breeze blew through the house, and the front window fell out of its frame. The glass fell on the priest and injured him, opening a deep gash in his head. The priest was so scared, he ran out into the street and was hit by a car. The young couple stayed with him and waited for the ambulance to arrive. As they were taking him away, the priest advised the couple to leave the house immediately. He said there was something evil in the house, and he promised that he would consult with his superiors in the church and find a way to help them. The couple weren't able to move out of the house. They couldn't afford to rent another place, and their parents lived in small apartments and had no room to take them in. They couldn't even sell the house because it had a bad reputation. Without understanding what was going on, the man with the woman were forced to go back to the house, which suddenly seemed very quiet, and begin to clean up after the unexplained events. The woman had a strange sensation of an unearthly presence in the house. She said that it was unusually quiet, like the calm before the storm. One day, they got a call from the priest, who had tried to bless the house. He asked if he could bring 2 other priests with him and carry out a ritual to rid the house of evil. Of course, the young couple agreed. The man and woman met the 3 priests in a nearby park and handed over the keys of the house. They waited in the park for the ritual to be finished. 3 hours later, the priests returned and told them that the house was now in order. The priests said they were surprised because while they performed the ritual, the evil in the house never showed itself once. After that, events began to develop at a frightening pace. One night, the wife had a terrible dream in which she saw thick black cobwebs all over the house, and heard a blood-curdling voice scream, "Get out! Get out!" The next morning, her husband was walking down the stairs, when a chandelier that hung in the hall fell on him and broke his leg. While they were at the hospital, their oven somehow caused a fire, and the entire kitchen burned down. Every day, something strange and terrible would happen that defied explanation. The last straw came when the young wife was at the top of the stairs, and she felt something strong push her down the stairs. When she was in the hospital, the doctors said that, due to her injuries, she would never be able to have children. The couple left the evil old house and rented a small, cheap attic room in a building on the other side of the city. This quiet little closet seemed like paradise to them, compared to their house of evil. A few months later, the man found out that all 3 priests who had performed the ritual in the old house were dead. They had been overseeing some renovations on their church, and a heavy crucifix had fallen off the wall and crushed them. The wife was horrified by the news and decided to dig through the archives and find out about the history of the house. She discovered that it had once been owned by a rich man with a terrible legacy. He had devoted his life to evil. He was a Satanist, and police suspected that he performed satanic rituals in the house that involved blood sacrifice and murder. A number of children in the area had gone missing. When the police knocked on his door, the rich man locked himself in his office and shot himself in the head. He was buried outside the cemetery and without a funeral service. It was after that terrible incident that the strange and terrible things began to occur in the house. All of the subsequent tenants who stayed in the house would not live in it for very long. They were constantly changing and running away. When the husband's grandmother came to live in the house, she was a young and beautiful woman. She married several times, but every one of her husbands died in the house under mysterious circumstances. By the time she was an old woman, she hoped that all the troubles associated with the house were over. But something terrible and incomprehensible must have happened there. One night that drove her out of her mind. When the sinister building was demolished, many people saw a strange black cloud rising into the sky. All of the birds in the trees seemed to flee from it. When she finished her story, the old woman said that today, the place is now a road. And at the exact spot where the house of evil once stood, there are often fatal car accidents. Basement Room. The Basement Room is a scary story about a family who experience a weird and disturbing supernatural presence in their cellar. Years ago, my family went on a vacation in Cape Cod, and we rented a small old house to stay in for 2 weeks. On the main floor was the kitchen, the living room and a bathroom. The bedrooms were on the second floor. There was a basement room downstairs, with a washer and dryer, a sofa and a television. On the first night, we were all awakened by a terrible scream from my sister's bedroom. When my dad burst into her room and turned on the light, he found her sitting up in bed, screaming and crying. My parents sat with her and comforted her until she finally calmed down enough to tell them what had scared her. She said that she had been awakened in the middle of the night by a horrible stench. When she opened her eyes, she had seen the entire bedroom soaked in blood from top to bottom. There was blood all over the floor, bloody handprints on the walls and blood spatter all over the ceiling. We all thought that she had just been having a nightmare, but she refused to go back into her bedroom and stayed in our parents' room for the remainder of the holiday. One evening, my mother was cooking dinner in the kitchen upstairs, and my father had gone out on an errand in a nearby town. My sister and I were in the basement room, watching TV, when all of a sudden, the light bulb popped and the TV went off, leaving us in complete darkness. The basement was unfinished and had old stone walls, making it a bit of a creepy place. For a few seconds, we just froze, not knowing what to do. Then we started to smell something horrible. It was a terrible stench. And when it hit our noses, we felt nauseous. It smelled like rotting flesh. The smell quickly grew worse and worse, and then we just heard a scratching in the darkness. Something seemed to be scratching at the floor or the walls. We screamed and began scrambling around in the pitch black, trying to find the door. Eventually, we managed to open the door and ran upstairs screaming to our mother. We kept telling her about the disgusting smell, and we heard something scratching and scraping around down there. My mother eventually agreed to go down to the basement, replace the bulb and check out the source of the horrible smell. She took a flashlight and a new bulb and disappeared into the darkened basement. As we waited for her at the top of the stairs, we expected her to return quickly, but she seemed to be down there for an eternity. Suddenly, we saw her emerge out of the darkness and come running up the stairs. She slammed the basement door behind her and bolted it as fast as she could. She turned to us and we could see her face had completely drained of color. Her eyes were wide with fear and she just said, "I don't want you going down there again." Then she went into the kitchen and called the police. We overheard her conversation on the phone and managed to figure out that she'd seen someone down in the basement room. As we waited for the police to come, we huddled together in the living room, staring at the basement door. At any moment, we expected to hear someone banging on it or trying to break it down. My mother refused to tell us what she had seen. When the police arrived, my mother greeted them at the front door and ushered them inside. She unbolted the basement door and they went down into the darkness with their flashlights out and their guns drawn. They searched the entire basement room, but found nothing. There was no other way out of the basement, no windows, no doors. Whatever was down there would have had to come up through the basement door. After the police left, my mother finally revealed what she had seen down there in the pitch-black basement room. As she spoke, she became very still and quiet. She said that she had been changing the light bulb downstairs, when she began to smell the horrible stench we had described to her. Then she started to hear a faint scratching noise. She shone her flashlight around the room and suddenly caught sight of something crouched between the washer and dryer. It was a man, crouched on all fours. His clothes were tattered, his hair was wild and tangled, and his face didn't look human. It was twisted in an expression of pure hatred. In that split second, he looked up at my mother, his eyes reflecting the beam from her flashlight. Then he suddenly crawled forward and disappeared through a wall. When my mother saw him simply vanish into thin air, she dropped the flashlight and ran. After that, none of us would go down in the basement. We kept the door locked and bolted. Every night, we slept in our parents' room and locked that door too. We cut our holiday short a few days later and just drove home. Three Boys. The Three Boys is a real ghost story about a boy who can't sleep at night and sees dead people. Are they imaginary or real? My parents died in a car crash when I was only 5 years old. After that, I was passed around to a number of foster homes and a number of different foster parents. Something happened in one of those foster homes that still scares me to this day. I remember that the lady who took me in was a really nice person, and I didn't see her husband much because he was always at work. I was the only foster child there at the time. One night, I couldn't get to sleep. When I opened my eyes, I saw another child standing there in my room. He seemed to be about the same age as me. He was naked from the waist up, and he had bruises all over his body. Tears were running down his face. I was so scared that I covered my head with the blankets. I think I just cowered there for the rest of the night praying for morning to come. The next time it happened, there were two boys. The second boy looked worse than the first. His face was all battered and bloody. One of his eyes was hanging out of his head. It was horrible. The third time was the worst. There were three boys standing there, and the third boy had his throat cut. Blood was pouring out of the wound and dripping down his chest. It seemed like someone had hacked at it with a knife. It scared me so much that I could never sleep. I don't remember much, but I was told that during the day, I would sit in the room and rock back and forth holding my chest, just staring at the entrance to the storage space. After a while, I was moved to a different foster home, and I never saw anything like that again. Just recently, I tracked down the woman who owned the foster home, and when I found out what had happened, it terrified me. Apparently, there were many orphaned boys who went through that house. 3 of them disappeared. The wife didn't know what had happened to them. She thought they had just run away. One day, many years later, she had to retrieve something from a small built-in storage space in the room that had been my bedroom. She was poking around and found some loose floorboards. Out of curiosity, she pulled one of the floorboards up, and when she saw what was underneath, she got the fright of her life. It was the body of a young boy. Of course, she called the police immediately. Her husband was at work at the time. The police ripped up the floorboards and found 3 bodies in all. They were all young boys. The bodies were removed and taken down to the mortuary for an autopsy. When the husband arrived home from work and found out what had happened, she said, he started acting really weird. The next day, the police came back and arrested the husband and the wife. They released the woman, but the husband was prosecuted for murdering the 3 boys. He was convicted, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison. Upstairs. Upstairs is a short horror story from Japan, about a young boy who comes home and hears his mother's voice calling him from a bedroom on the 2nd floor of the house. When I was a child, I lived in a rented 2-floor house. My father and mother both had to work, so I was often alone in the house when I got back from school. One day, I was delayed on my way back from school. It was early evening when I got home and the house was dark. I called out, "Mum," and heard a faint voice say yes from upstairs. I called my mom again, and again got the same yes reply. It sounded like she was calling me, so I started climbing up the stairs. When I reached the 1st floor, I called her once more, and heard the yes coming from the back's bedroom. I felt a certain uneasiness, and wanted to see my mother as soon as possible, so I hurried closer to the back room. I was about to open the bedroom door, when suddenly, I heard sound of the front door downstairs opening. My mother came in, carrying lots of shopping bags. "Sweetie, I'm back. Are you home?" she called out to me in a bright voice. Hearing her voice, I completely regained my confidence and ran downstairs. Just then, I happened to glance over my shoulder towards the back bedroom. The door to the room slowly opened with a creak. For a moment, I saw something strange in the gap of the door. The pale face of a man was staring directly at me.